In production and development, open source as a development model promotes universal access via a free license to a product's design or blueprint, and universal redistribution of that design or blueprint, including subsequent improvements to it by anyone. Before the phrase open source became widely adopted, developers and producers used a variety of other terms. Open source gained hold with the rise of the Internet, and the attendant need for massive retooling of the computing source code. Opening the source code enabled a self-enhancing diversity of production models, communication paths, and interactive communities. The open-source software movement arose to clarify the environment that the new copyright, licensing, domain, and consumer issues created. Generally, open source refers to a computer program in which the source code is available to the general public for use or modification from its original design. Open source code is meant to be a collaborative effort, where programmers improve upon the source code and share the changes within the community. Typically this is not the case, and code is merely released to the public under some license. Others can then download, modify, and publish their version back to the community. Today you find more projects with forked versions than unified projects worked by large teams. Many large formal institutions have sprung up to support the development of the open source movement, including the Apache Software Foundation, which supports projects such as the open source framework behind Big Data Apache Hadoop and an open source HTTP server Apache HTTP. The open source model is based on a more decentralized model of production, in contrast with more centralized models of development such as those typically used in commercial software companies. A main principle of open-source software development is peer production, with products such as source code, blueprints, and documentation available to the public at no cost. The open-source movement in software began as a response to the limitations of proprietary code, and has since spread across different fields. This model is also used for the development of open-source appropriate technologies, solar photovoltaic technology and open-source drug discovery. History. Sharing of technological information before the Internet. The sharing of technological information predates the Internet and the personal computer considerably. For instance, in the early years of automobile development, a group of capital monopolists owned the rights to a two-cycle gasoline engine patent originally filed by George B. Selden. By controlling this patent, they were able to monopolize the industry and force car manufacturers to adhere to the demands, or risk a lawsuit. In 1911, independent automaker Henry Ford won a challenge to the Selden patent. The result was that the Selden patent became virtually worthless and a new association was formed. The new association instituted a cross-licensing agreement among all U.S. auto manufacturers. Although each company would develop technology and file patents, these patents were shared openly and without the exchange of money among all the manufacturers. By the time the U.S. entered World War II, 92 Ford patents and 515 patents from other companies were being shared among these manufacturers, without any exchange of money. Sharing of information with computers in an open call process analogous to later Internet-era open standards processes. ARPANET researchers used an open request for comments process to encourage feedback in early telecommunication network protocols. This collaborative process of the 1960s led to the birth of the early Internet in 1969. Early instances of the free sharing of source code include IBM's source releases of its operating systems and other programs in the 1950s and 1960s. And the share user group that formed to facilitate the exchange of software. In a foreshadowing of the Internet, software with source code included became available on BBS networks in the 1980s. This was sometimes a necessity. Distributing software written in BASIC and other interpreted languages can only be distributed as source code as there is no separate portable executable binary to distribute. Example of BBS systems and networks that gathered source code and set up boards specifically to discuss its modification includes WWIV, developed initially in BASIC by Wayne Bell. A culture of modifying his software and distributing the modifications grew up so extensively that where the software was ported to first Pascal, then C++, its source code continued to be distributed to registered users, who would share mods and compile their own versions of the software. This may have contributed to its being a dominant system and network, despite being outside the FidoNet umbrella that was shared by so many other BBS makers. The sharing of source code on the Internet began when the Internet was relatively primitive, with software distributed via UUCP, Usenet, IRC, and Gopher. BSD, for example, was first widely distributed by posts to comp.os.linux on the Usenet, which is also where its development was discussed. Linux followed in this model. The emergence of the open source term. The term open source was first proposed by a group of people in the free software movement who were critical of the political agenda and moral philosophy implied in the term free software, and sought to reframe the discourse to reflect a more commercially minded position. The group included Christine Peterson, Todd Anderson, Larry Augustin, John Hall, Sam Mockman, Michael Tiemann and Eric S. Raymond. Peterson suggested open source at a meeting held at Palo Alto, California, in reaction to Netscape's announcement in January 1998 of a source code release for Navigator. Linus Torvalds gave his support the following day, and Phil Hughes backed the term in Linux Journal. Richard Stallman, the founder of the free software movement, initially seemed to adopt the term, but later changed his mind. Netscape released its source code under the Netscape public license and later under the Mozilla public license. Raymond was especially active in the effort to popularize the new term. He made the first public call to the free software community to adopt it in February 1998. Shortly after, he founded the Open Source Initiative in collaboration with Bruce Perens. The term gained further visibility through an event organized in April 1998 by technology publisher Tim O'Reilly. Originally titled the Freeware Summit, and later known as the Open Source Summit. The event was attended by the leaders of many of the most important free and open source projects, including Linus Torvalds, Larry Wall, Brian Behlendorf, Eric Holman, Guido van Rossum, Michael Tiemann, Paul Vixie, Jamie Zawinski, and Eric Raymond. At that meeting, alternatives to the term free software were discussed. Tiemann argued for sourceware as a new term, while Raymond argued for open source. The assembled developers took a vote, and the winner was announced at a press conference the same evening. Open source has never managed to supersede entirely the older term free software, giving rise to the combined term free and open source software. Economics. Most economists agree that open source candidates have an information good aspect. In general, this suggests that the original work involves a great deal of time, money, and effort. However, the cost of reproducing the work is very low, so that additional users may be added at zero or near zero cost. This is referred to as the marginal cost of a product. Copyright creates a monopoly, so the price charged to consumers can be significantly higher than the marginal cost of production. This allows the author to recoup the cost of making the original work, without needing to find a single customer that can bear the entire cost. Conventional copyright thus creates access costs for consumers who value the work more than the marginal cost but less than the initial production cost. Access costs also pose problems for authors who wish to create a derivative work, such as a copy of a software program modified to fix a bug or add a feature, or a remix of a song, but are unable or unwilling to pay the copyright holder for the right to do so. Being organized effectively as a consumers cooperative, The idea of open source is to eliminate the access costs of the consumer and the creators of derivative works by reducing the restrictions of copyright. Basic economic theory predicts that lower costs would lead to higher consumption and also more frequent creation of derivative works. Additionally, some proponents argue that open source also relieves society of the administration and enforcement costs of copyright. Organizations such as Creative Commons have websites where individuals can file for alternative licenses or levels of restriction for their works. These self-made protections free the general society of the costs of policing copyright infringement. Thus, on several fronts, there is an efficiency argument to be made on behalf of open-source goods. However, others argue that because consumers do not pay for the copies, creators are unable to recoup the initial cost of production, and thus have no economic incentive to create in the first place. By this argument, consumers would lose out because some of the goods they would otherwise purchase would not be available at all. In practice, content producers can choose whether to adopt a proprietary license and charge for copies, or an open license. Some goods which require large amounts of professional research and development, such as the pharmaceutical industry, are almost exclusively proprietary. Although increasingly sophisticated technologies are being developed on open-source principles, there is growing evidence, however, that open-source development creates enormous value. For example, in the context of open-source hardware design, digital designs are shared for free, and then anyone with access to digital manufacturing technologies can replicate the product for the cost of materials. The original sharer gains feedback and potentially improvements on the original design from the peer production community. There is now significant evidence that such sharing creates enormous value. Alternative arrangements have also been shown to result in good creation outside of the proprietary model. Examples include creation for its own sake. For example, Wikipedia editors add content for recreation. Artists have a drive to create. Both communities benefit from free starting material. Voluntary after-the-fact donations, used by shareware, street performers, and public broadcasting in the United States. Patron. For example, open-access publishing relies on institutional and government funding of research faculty, who also have a professional incentive to publish for reputation and career advancement. Works of the U.S. federal government are automatically released into the public domain. Freemium. Give away a limited version for free and charge for a premium version. Give away the product and charge something related. Charge for support of open source enterprise software. Give away music but charge for concert admission. Give away work in order to gain market share, used by artists in corporate software to spoil a dominant competitor. For own use, businesses or individual software developers often create software to solve a problem, bearing the full cost of initial creation. They will then open source the solution, and benefit from the improvements others make for their own needs. Communalizing the maintenance burden distributes the cost across more users. Free riders can also benefit without undermining the creation process.